Now that we've seen how to handle the submit event of a button inside of our to-do item create component, the next thing we want to talk about are input controls or elements inside of our JSX and inside of an HTML form within our page. Now the interesting thing is that within HTML, regular elements like the div or the button or a paragraph or a span, all of these are controlled. Well, they're all elements that actually just display and render inside of the browser. And because they are controlled by the HTML that gets injected into the page, they are considered controlled elements within our page. HTML form inputs, on the other hand, are considered to be uncontrolled elements inside of our JSX. And that's because these particular elements, they hold their own state. In other words, they record and remember what has been typed into them by the user using our application. And so when we switch these right here from just regular text, as we have had them so far, into actual inputs, form inputs, and we specify the type to be text, what happens is we have now introduced into our component, let's go ahead and copy this one, we've introduced into our component some HTML elements that are uncontrolled by our component. In other words, right now, let's switch over to our browser, these input fields you can see are blank and they store information when the user types in them. And when we click submit, really, we have no idea what's in here and we have no idea what has been changed because these inputs are actually not controlled by our component. So what we need to do is we need to move them from uncontrolled to controlled by our component so that we then know exactly, or that the values that are placed in them and the values that are pulled out of them are controlled 100% by our component rather than simply by the browser. So to do that, we're going to follow the same pattern we did down here with the button and the ref pattern. And we're going to start out with creating our references to our inputs. And one input will be for name and one input will be for description. So let's go ahead and let's start off by creating those references first. So here we're going to do the exact same thing we did with the submit button. We're going to do this dot name input equals react.create ref. That'll give us a reference to that one. We'll do this dot description input equals react.create ref. Right, so similar to our submit button, we now have a way to reference those inputs from within our component via JSX or via the ref attribute in our JSX. So let's go ahead and add our refs to each of these. So do ref equals, and then this dot name input. And then we're going to go ahead and for this one do ref equals, and then we will do this dot description input. And it looks like we accidentally had an extra this right here, so let's get rid of that. All right, this dot name input, this dot description input. Now we have references to these two inputs, but what is inside of them, if we go back to our thing, is still empty. It's not related to our state. If we notice, our state up here has a name and a description with actual values in them, but we can see that they are not showing up here yet. We can still type in these and we can change the value, but we still don't know, or we still don't have those values assigned to them, nor do we know what's inside of them when we click submit. And let's go ahead and add to our submit handler right here. Let's add to this log the this.state, just so we can see what's inside of that object when we click submit. Here you can see this is new to do. This is the description of the new to do. So we really want these values right here to show up in here, which means we need to make these inputs controlled by our component. And we can do that by setting on our components the default value that we want to show up inside of that, and we're gonna set it to this.state.name right here and this.state.description in order to make sure the values that first show up here when our page loads or when our component loads are the proper ones. So let's do that right here. And we're just going to go ahead and we are going to add to our name input a default value. And the default value is going to be this.state.name. And then we're going to do the same down here for our description input. So let's do our default value equals this.state.description. Now when we save this and it recompiles and we come back to our web page, we should see the values in here now. And if we click submit, we see that they map up. Now one thing here though is if we edit what is in here and we click submit, we can see that the values got updated based on the fact that we had that dummy update right here inside of our submit handler. So we do see that getting updated, but it's not being updated by what we're writing here inside of our form. Instead, it's just that dummy data that we're updating. So I'm going to go ahead and we're going to remove, actually let's not remove this.setState yet. Actually, let's get rid of it completely. That way we can see when we save it and we rebuild it, we see that the values are the same. But after we change them, they're still the same. So we can see that these are not yet fully controlled by our component. So we now have a reference to them. We have a default value. Now we need to do something similar as to what we did with the button, in that we need to provide an event handler right here to handle the onChange event of the inputs. Now onChange events are fired once information is changed inside of our input and then the cursor leaves that input field. That's when those get fired. And right now we see nothing getting fired and no changes are being stored. So let's go ahead and change that by adding in our handlers right here so that we know exactly what handlers we need to bind to this component. So let's do a name change handler. Of course, it's going to pull in an event. And then inside of this event handler, this is where we are going to identify that a change has happened. So let's go ahead and let's do the same kind of logging that we did down here in the submit handler. And let's do custom event. And then here, oh, looks like we spelled it handler. Should be handler. All right. And this is our, not our buttons, not our submit button handler, but this is our name change handler. And then we're going to want to see the state before the change happens. So we'll do this dot set state. And this is the really cool part right here of adding this onChange handler. And just like we did down here in the submit handler when we were just passing dummy data, now we're actually going to be able to set the state based on changes that are made inside of this input once we bind this handler to the change event of this input field. And it follows the exact same process that we did for the submit button. So let's finish this change handler, this.setState, and it is going to be changing the name attribute or property of our state. And we can pull the value of the input box that this gets attached to by doing e.target. Target gets us back the HTML element that was the target of the event. And then we can pull value out. And with this, when this handler gets called, setState will get called. The name attribute or property of our state, this one right here, will be updated with whatever the value is inside of the HTML element that was the target of this event, which if we attach it to this one right here, the name, we should see that event fired when we have changes in here. But as you can see right now, no changes happen because we have not bound that handler to this yet. So now that we've got our name change handler, we need to do the same thing that we did up here with the submit handler, is we need to make sure we bind it to our component. So this name change handler equals this name change handler bind, and pass it this. And now when we make changes inside of that, oh nope, so we just barely bound it, but we still haven't tied this handler. So this has been bound to our component, but it's still not tied to our to-do into this name input field. And you'll notice that when I switch out of it, no events are getting fired down here. So we still, even though it's now bound to our component as an actual method so that we can use this, we now need to bind it to this name input element reference. And we did that inside of the component did mount. So I'm going to go ahead and add it right here. We're going to say this dot name input, that's the one we want to bind it to, dot current to get the current HTML element. Then we do an add event listener. Now it is the change event of an input. A lot of people have the, they want to put on change because that's the event when you're working inside of HTML or JSX. But you get rid of the on and then it's just the name of the event. So change. We want to add an event listener for the change event, and then we want to do this dot name change handler as the handler for that particular event on the name input field. So now that it's rebuilt, we can go back in here and we should be able to change this. This has been changed. And now when we click out of it, we should see it fired down here. We see a custom event, the name change handler has been fired. And we can see that this still has the this is a new to do, and this is the description of the new to do. Well, that is because inside of our name change handler, we called this.state right when we did this log, and this.setState has not been called yet. Even if we ran this after the setState, we would still find that it would hold the old values. And that's because if we remember about setState on a component, this.setState is a queue. It's a function that queues this state change and prepares it in so that the component can then make the state change when it's ready to. And then when it actually makes the state change, then it will re-render the JSX with whatever the changes are to the JSX based on if this value, this name, is tied to anything in the JSX, which it is right here. So even if we move this down below, we're still going to see the same. So let's come over here. It's redone. Let's change this, come out of it, and we see the change right here. That means this set state change happened so quickly that when we call this.state, that change has happened. That means it's executing super fast. But keep in mind that this is still a queued event that the component is queuing for that change. If this change or if this state change was any more complex, it might take a few milliseconds longer, and therefore we would see the same state down here in this right here. But we're going to leave it right there so we can see that it changed right there because it's happening super fast. Let's try that again. Let's go ahead and reload. Let's change this to just an R, submit, change it to an R. That's awesome. Okay. Now, since our submit handler already prints out the state, we can go ahead and get rid of this. And now our state will only get printed out when the submit happens, not when the change handler happens. Let's go ahead and do this. Click out of it. You can see it fired a render. Submit. Now we see the changes right there because the re-render happened. All right. So now we've got this one all bound, and it's actually bound to the state. So this is now a controlled input within our component. This one is still uncontrolled because we can change whatever it is, click submit, and it stays the same. So let's go through the same process and make our description input a bound input as well. So again, don't have to make any changes down here because we already have the reference set up. We already have the default value. So it's just a matter of creating our custom event handler. So here we've got a name change. I'm going to copy it, bring it down. We're going to change it to description change handler. And then we're going to change this to description. And then of course we need to go bind it. So I'm going to copy this one. Let's change this to description change handler, description change handler. And then we'll go down here to our component did mount. I'm going to copy this one, paste it. This is going to be our description input. And then we're going to pass it the description change handler as its event handler. And now we have everything all bound up. So everything is tied together. So we should see changes to both of these. So we've got this one. Change this to something else. Click submit. We can see that our state is now changed. Our state of our component is now bound to these inputs. The inputs are bound back to the state. And our components are now actually controlled inputs inside of our component. So our name input and our description inputs are now controlled by our component. Both what they originally show up with when the page is first loaded, as well as whatever they get edited to. Submit again. We should see those changes right there. Perfect. Right. So we're going to call that good on our discussion for uncontrolled versus controlled HTML input or form inputs within our components and how we can get them under control and bind them to our application or to our component.